I'm going to be talking and echoing one of the things that Dr. Pachauri said at the very beginning, the famous Limits to Growth publication that came out over 40 years ago. Some of us remember it from the first Stockholm Conference on the Environment. And I want to revisit the Limits to Growth. The Limits to Growth was a very seminal report that appeared, and it had an enormous impact in 1972. And through its computer modeling of the interactions between population, food production, industrial output, pollution, and non-renewable resources, it concluded that the world would encounter severe limits to growth before about the middle of the 21st century if we continued with business as usual. Now, I want to suggest today that the essential messages of that study are still highly relevant to our planetary predicament. Now, the debate on the limits to growth has ignited and reignited intermittently over the past 4 decades. In 1992, to coincide with the Earth Summit in Rio, 3 of the Limits authors published a follow-up called Beyond the Limits. And later, in 2004, they produced a 30-year update, which they reiterated with renewed vigor their original thesis and updated their forecasts and scenarios for the 21st century. Now, recent research suggests that the Limits 1972 modeling was more valid than its critics suggested. In a 2008 report, Graham Turner from CSIRO in Australia compared real data on population, production, resources, and pollution from 1970 to 2000 with those projected in the Limits to Growth 1972 graphs. And he found that the data over the 3 decades matched quite closely the Limits projections. And last year, one of the Limits authors, Professor Jürgen Randers, produced a new report called simply 2050, and again endorsed by the Club of Rome. Now, this produces a single forecast of the evolution of the world's population and economy over the next 40 years. Now, he's well aware that such forecasts are inherently very uncertain, and he calls his an educated guess. In his model, he estimates that population will peak at about 8 billion in 2040, a little bit less than UN estimates. He reckons the world economy will continue to grow, but more slowly, with world energy peaking around 2050 and carbon emissions peaking around 2030. He believes that, in fact, now the world will not overshoot the limits before the middle of this century because the rate of growth in world population and the economy will be lower than in conventional forecasts. But he does see climate change as a key problem and regretfully concludes that over the next 40 years, the world's political system and economic system will fail to do enough to tackle it, so mean global temperatures will increase above the 2-degree threshold, and the share of world production needing to be invested in coping with pollution, civil unrest, and the other attendant problems will increase, leaving decreasing amounts for consumption. But Randa still believes that radical changes are essential, but due to limits in political systems and the resistance of vested interests, they won't happen until 2050. Now, many of the aspects of the Limits to Growth critique were echoed just in spring of last year by Britain's premier scientific academy, the Royal Society, which in its report People and Planet warned that in the richest parts of the world, per capita material consumption is far above that level which can be sustained for everyone in a population of 7 billion or more. Or, as Gandhi aptly put it, there is a sufficiency in the world for a man's need, but not for man's greed. So, what would a world without relentless economic growth look like, and how might we get there? In Prosperity Without Growth, Professor Tim Jackson's 2009 report to the UK Sustainable Development Commission, which was led by Jonathan Porter, I'm pleased to say will be speaking later in this conference. He identifies 3 categories of change required for a transition to a sustainable economy. The first includes setting up strict reduction emission targets for emissions and resource consumption, shifting the tax burden from goods to bads, and getting rich countries to fund an ecological transition in the poor countries. The second change involves developing a new system of ecological macroeconomics. It involves investing in jobs, assets, and infrastructures, increasing financial and fiscal prudence, and revising the system of national accounts. The third change, he suggests, involves sharing work more evenly and cutting down on overwork, reducing inequalities both within and between nations, dismantling consumerism by giving people better ways of finding satisfaction, and introducing better measures of human welfare than mere GDP. But today, of course, the leaders of the world's economic and political systems seem bent on the pursuit of growth at any cost. But in the European Union and in other countries, such as Japan, the past few years have seen near zero growth. And in other major countries, such as China and India, we've seen growth at a reduced pace. So instead of viewing the current situation as an economic crisis, I suggest we look on it as a golden opportunity to begin a radical transition to a greener, fairer, happier, sustainable future for the planet and all its inhabitants. In the words of the UK's New Economics Foundation, this could be one of history's great transitions, leading to a world in which we live within the limits of the natural world and more fairly with each other, locally, nationally, and globally, where we focus on the things that really matter. Such a transition will require many profound changes, and in my own field of renewable energy, there are many studies recently that show renewables could provide 95 to 100% of the world's energy by around 2050. The technologies already exist, although they're still improving in efficiency and reducing in cost. What's really needed is the political will, and here I echo John Prescott again, to implement a rapid transition to a sustainable circular economy based on materials reuse and recycling powered by zero-carbon renewables. Now, of course, beyond the sphere of energy and materials, this great transition will need to embrace a wide range of radically new social and economic paradigms, many of which I hope we'll discuss, and we already are discussing at this summit. But I believe such a transition is feasible. No doubt there will be opposition, but the opposition to such changes are likely to follow the trajectory so aptly summarized by Gandhi, who the anniversary of his 65th anniversary of whose death we celebrate, if that's the right word, just in the last couple of days. He said that first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. Thank you very much.
Yeah.